Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. How are we all today? I hope you enjoyed the first lecture on production or on the background to supply. And I hope you enjoyed some of the examples that were given in that lecture. The example of the ice cream, the mobile ice cream seller, the example of the tannoor, the mango producer, the airline, the wheat farmer. Remember that all these examples, while they are fun to examine and analyze, are intended primarily to bring out in you a better understanding of the underlying concepts in economics. So if you remember the examples well, then there is a very good chance that you will understand the intuition very well as well. Now, before we build on those examples and the underlying intuition, those examples, let's do a little recap on what we learned in our previous lecture. Now, we started our discussion by looking at the theory of the firm, the traditional theory of the firm. And we saw that basically it involved the decision to price the products and to produce quantities of different products by the firm in light of its desire to maximize profits. And we saw that there could be alternative theories of the firm as well. That is, firms could target sales growth, or ousting a competitor from the market, or creating a good environment to work in, or benefiting the society. Those could all be alternative goals that a particular firm could have. But making money, making profits, and maximizing total profits was one goal that was likely to appear in the objectives list of virtually any firm in the economy. We then said that total profits are simply total revenues minus total costs, and that in order to understand how firms can maximize their total profits, we need to understand how they can maximize their total revenues and how they can minimize their total costs. Now, in our discussion on costs, we began by discriminating between the long run and the short run. And we said that a long run scenario or situation was one in which all the factors of production which appeared in the production function, remember the production function Q is equal to F and the inputs laid out there in the brackets, that all the inputs in the production function were considered variable. So for an airline, if it was confronted by increased demand, then it could purchase new aircraft or order new aircraft in the long run. And for that airline, we defined the long run as 3 to 5 years. We gave the example of the mango producer who had a long run of over 10, 12 years, because mango trees take that much time to grow up and begin bearing fruit. So we distinguished between long run and short run scenarios. Then we focused on the short run and said that we now have one factor, at least one factor, which is fixed. So we gave the example of wheat production, in which we took land as the fixed factor and we took labor as the variable factor. And we illustrated the famous law of diminishing marginal returns. And we said that the law simply states that as you increase the employment of one of the variable factor with a fixed given factor, which in our case was land, then the additional output that additional variable factor will help produce will become less and less as you produce more, as you employ more of that factor. So beyond a point, the output could actually start falling, given that it has a declining trend. We drew these trends in graphical form. So we developed the total physical product concept, the average physical product concept, the marginal physical product concepts, and we plotted them on graphs. We saw that the TPP curve was an upward sloping curve which initially had an increasing slope, then that slope tapered off, became zero, and then actually became negative. We saw how the APP and the MPP curves were drawn. We saw what the implication was of the intersection between the MPP and the APP curves. We also, on the side, studied the relationship between APP and MPP. We saw that if the MPP was greater than the APP, this would cause the APP to rise. It would pull the APP function up. Whereas if the MPP was equal to the APP would remain constant. Whereas if the MPP was less than the APP, then the APP would fall. That was broadly what we discussed in our previous lecture. Now in today's lecture, we will talk a little bit about the long-run theory of production. So remember, earlier we discussed the short-run situation that a producer faced. Now we are in the long-run realm. So we see what happens to producers and firms' decision-making process once they're in the long run, that is, they have the flexibility to change all the inputs, all the factors of production that they can use to produce goods and services. Now, once we are in the long run, the decision-making problem for the firm is far more complicated than it was when it was in the short run. Because in the short run, some of the factors are fixed, and therefore the firm can't decide as to what it should do with those factors because they are given as fixed. So in some ways, this is an advantage also because the firm does not have to think about that aspect of the problem. But in the long run, the firm's problem becomes much more complicated. And it is really in the long run that good firms or good management can be distinguished from bad management or bad planning. Because you really get a chance to maximize your profits, to maximize the benefit that you can derive from the decisions that you take, because you have a lot of flexibility. What is the flexibility that you have? Number one, you have the flexibility to change or vary the factors of production that you are using. So capital is variable, labor can be varied, land can be varied, buildings can be constructed, plants can be made, new aircraft can be purchased, as in that example of airliners that we gave. So that's one dimension of flexibility that you have. The other dimension is that of scale, and we will develop this shortly. And scale is the size of operations that you want for your firm, whether you want to produce 100 units of output, or whether you want to produce 500 units of output, or whether you want to cut down on your production and bring it down to 50 or 25. So it depends very much on how the firm sees itself in the future. Does it see itself as growing? And what relationship it thinks is there between the scale of operations and the costs of operations. If it thinks that becoming bigger will become more costly, then it might want to remain smaller. But if it thinks that becoming bigger has cost advantages and market share advantages, which has future revenue benefits, then it might want to become bigger. So that's one decision that the firm has to take regarding the scale of operations. Another decision that the firm has to take is regarding location. It has to decide where to set up the firm, where to set up the plant, which markets to sell, which markets to service, right? And this is another decision which can have a crucial impact on the long-run costs that the firm bears. Then firm decisions are also affected by the size of the industry as a whole. You see, there are certain factors that the firm can control, but there are certain factors that it cannot. So if the industry is growing overall, this can have implications for this firm in the long run, right? And this is also something that we need to factor in our discussion of the long run. Finally, and most importantly, the firm needs to decide what is the combination of the different inputs that it should use in order to produce a certain quantity of goods and services. And if it is in the realm of one good only, that is, if we are talking about just one good that the firm is producing, then the firm needs to decide what proportion of capital, labor, land, machinery, power it needs to employ in order to produce a certain quantity of that one good. So the optimal or the optimum combination of inputs is the fundamental problem that the firm has to solve. It has to come up with that optimal combination that will minimize its long-run costs and therefore maximize its long-run profits. Now, let's start our discussion by talking about the decision regarding the scale of operations. And basically, we need to introduce the concept of returns to scale. Return, as you know, basically means the benefit that you get out of something, right? So the returns to scale would basically mean the benefit that you will get out of choosing a certain level or scale of production. That is, if you are very big, that has a certain benefit attached to it. If you are small, that has a certain benefit attached to it. And notions of returns to scale are linked to the size of operations that the firm has. Now, it's important to distinguish between three types of returns to scale. A firm can either have constant returns to scale, or increasing returns to scale, or decreasing returns to scale. Please don't confuse the returns to scale or decreasing returns to scale with diminishing returns to factors, right? Because they are two very different things. I will illustrate through an example actually how the two are very different. But let me first define these three terms. Constant returns to scale. Let's assume that a certain product uses capital and labor for its production, right? And that initially you have 100 units of that product which are produced using 10 units of capital and 20 units of labor, right? 10 units of capital, 20 units of labor, and they are combined to produce 100 units of that particular product. Now, constant returns to scale would mean that if you increased both capital and labor by, let's say, 50%, then the production or the output that you have should also increase by 50%. So in this particular case, if you had 10 units of capital and 20 units of labor, and you increased your capital by 50%, that is, your capital went to 15, and it increased your labor by 50%, that is, your labor was increased to 30, so both have been increased by 50%. The impact on production would be that it would go from 100 to 150 units. That is an increase of 50%. So if the proportion of increase in both or all the inputs on the right-hand side of the production function is equal to the proportional increase in the production or the output which appears on the left-hand side of the production function, then we are in the realm of constant returns to scale, right? Now, an example of increasing returns to scale would be when capital and labor both increase by, let's say, 50%, but output increases by more than 50%. So if capital and labor were 10 and 20 units respectively earlier, and then capital goes up to 15 and labor goes up to 30, that is both increased by 50%, output now does not go to 150, it goes to 175. So that is, there is a 75% increase in output. When you have this situation, you have increasing returns to scale. You could also have decreasing returns to scale. And that is, if capital went up to 15 and labor went up to 30, that is 50% increase, output goes up by less than 50%. That is, it goes from 100 to 125 or 130. That is the case of decreasing returns to scale. So understand these three terms very well, and now we should be able to understand the relationship or the difference between returns to scale and diminishing returns to factor. Now, the key difference between diminishing returns to factor and returns to scale, let's say decreasing returns to scale, is that decreasing returns to scale is a concept which relates to the long run. So you're talking about changes in all the inputs, proportionate changes in all the inputs, capital, labor, if there is land, then land also has to increase by the same percentage. Whereas when we were talking about diminishing returns to factors, we were talking about essentially the short run. That is, if one of the factors or all of the other factors were fixed and there was just one factor which was increased or changed, the effect on output would be such that the total physical product would have a declining trend. That is, marginal physical product would rise and then fall, taper off eventually. That was the concept of diminishing marginal returns to factors, individual factors. Let's illustrate this through the use of a slide. Now, as you can see in this table, on the left-hand side, we have an illustration of the short-run scenario for a firm, and on the right-hand side, we have the long run. On the left-hand side, we see the two inputs, input 1 and input 2. They could be capital and labor, or labor and land, or some other combination. So in the short run, as we know, one of the inputs is fixed, right? So let's say input 1 is fixed. It is fixed at 3 units. So it is 3 in all the possible scenarios. Now input 2 varies from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Now the diminishing returns to factor concept can be illustrated through the last column. That is the output column, where you see output rising from 25 to 45 to 60 to 70 to 75. And if you take the marginal increase in the output due to increases in input 2, you will see that for the increase from 1 to 2, the marginal physical product is 10. Then from 2 to 3, the marginal physical product is 15, that is 60 minus 45. Then from 3 to 4, the marginal physical product is 10, that is 70 minus 60. Then from 4 to 5, the marginal physical product is 5, that is 75 minus 70. So the marginal physical product is falling. It rises initially from 10 to 15, but then it starts to fall. This is diminishing returns to variable factor, the factor that is varying in the short run. On the right-hand side, you see the case for the long run. So you see that both factors are now changing. Now let's take the first line. You have one unit of input 1 and 1 unit of input 2. And the output produced is, let's say, 15. Now in the second row, you have both inputs increasing by, yes, 100%. That is 2 minus 1 divided by 1. So that's an increase of 100%. Now what has output changed by? It has gone up from 15 to 35. That is an increase of 20 units. Now if you divide 20 by the starting value of the output, you will get 20 over 15, which gives you 133%. So as you can see, an increase in the inputs of 100% has caused an increase in the output of 133%. So we are in the realm of increasing returns to scale. You can then confirm that from going from 2 to 3 and then 3 to 4 and 4 to 5, that is increases of 50%, 33% and 25%, we get corresponding increases of 71%, 50% and 38% in output. So in all these cases, the proportionate change in all of the inputs is less than the resulting proportionate change in output. Now there are two important points to note from that example. One is that you had, for the same example, diminishing returns to factors, right? That was in the short run. But when you had the long run example case for the same production process, you had increasing returns to scale. So diminishing returns to factors do not necessarily mean that the firm will have decreasing returns to scale. There is no direct link between those two things, and that's very important for you to register. The second point to note there is that diminishing returns to factors is something that holds like a law. It's a law of economics, that whenever the quantity of one factor increases, holding all other factors fixed, the output, the marginal output or the marginal physical product of that factor falls as the quantity of the factor increases. The increasing, decreasing or constant returns to scale state of a firm as to whether it has increasing, decreasing or constant returns to scale depends on the production process, on the type of industry, on various other factors which are not in the form of a law of economics, right? So it can vary from firm to firm. And as we will see later on in our discussion of monopolies and oligopolies, there are certain industries in which naturally increasing returns to scale exist and therefore warrant a larger scale of operations by firms. Now a simple question arises here that if a firm faces the situation that our firm does, that the example that we just gave, in which there are increasing returns to scale, that is, if inputs increase by 50% proportionately, then output will increase by 100% or 75% or whatever that amount is greater than 50%. What implications does that have for the firm's decision about the scale of operations? Well, the obvious answer is that the firm would like to increase or expand its scale of operations in this case. Why? Well, the answer is simple. When you increase your inputs by, let's say, 10%, so if you increase your capital by 10% or your labor by 10%, the quantity of labor or capital used, you increase the costs proportionately as well. So you increase capital cost by 10%, you increase your labor's cost by 10%. So your total cost goes up by, yes, 10%. But what happens to your output? Well, your output goes up by more than 10%. Let's say it goes up by 15%. So if you multiply it then by price, then your total revenue increases by more than 10%. That is, it goes up by 15%. So for any proportionate increase in inputs, your output proportionately increases more and your total revenues proportionately increase more. Therefore, the net impact on your profits is positive. Therefore, it makes sense for that firm to keep expanding its output. Now, the underlying concept that is used or that is often cited in economics is economies of scale. And this is just another way of looking at increasing returns to scale. Economies of scale basically mean that as you increase your operational size, as the firm becomes bigger and bigger, it realizes cost savings or economies. The term economies here refers to cost savings or lower costs, right? So when you have economies of scale, what that means is the lower total cost of operation that results from producing at a very large scale. That is what the term economies of scale means. It's a very widely used term. It has its opposite, which is diseconomies of scale, and it's important that we fully understand these two concepts. Let's spend some time on this using some examples. Let's start by looking at it from this angle as to why a large firm might experience economies of scale. Now, the first and foremost thing to see here is that very large plants usually have specialized labor working on specialized tasks. So there is often very good division of labor. Consider a person manufacturing a cycle or putting together a cycle, one person or two people. Well, they'll be involved in multiple tasks, right? Some of them will be involved in soldering the different pieces of the bicycle together. The other person might be putting the seat on, stitching the seat, things like that, putting on the lights, turning the lights, making connections of wires. But think of how the same could be done in a production plant, in a large plant. Well, there you will have a certain section of the workforce working entirely on the body of the cycle, so putting all the steel parts together. Then another section of the workforce will be involved in getting the electrical connections right, like putting the lights on, connecting it with the dynamo, things like that. The third section might be involved in painting the bike, right? So people or workers can be allocated to specialized tasks in very large plants. And when people are involved in specialized tasks, they can often do the tasks more efficiently. The idea is that as you do a task more and more, you develop skill in doing it. You can do it better. Rather than when you are involved in different tasks, you have to do this and then that and then that, you might not be able to develop the level of skill in all of them compared to when you are working on just one task and you can focus your faculties and energies on that one task and develop very high skill in that. That's one. The other is that training the people is also easier. When you are training somebody who does 10 tasks, you need somebody who knows those 10 tasks to train that person, right? But when you have large plants where there is specialization and division of labor, you can often find instructors or people or trainers who are specialists in one task. So they will pick all the workers doing that one task and train them in that task and tell them how they can do that task better. So training is often less expensive. There can be other reasons as well, but this is just a couple of reasons to tell you why large plants which have specialization and division of labor can often lead to cost efficiencies or economies of scale. Another case in which increasing the size of the inputs might increase the economies that you derive from that or might reduce your total costs would arise when you have a production process which involves the use of containers like hollow things. So blast furnaces, oil tankers, pipes which are empty from inside, or these long trailers that carry cars and other luggage. These are all examples of things which contain other things within them. So if you increase the size of a container, right? So if you have a small container and then you increase its size, often the benefit that you can derive from the higher size is greater than the increase in cost. Now let me illustrate this through some very basic mathematics that you must have done earlier. Think of a small cubical container which has six sides, 1 by 1 by 1. All three, the dimensions length, breadth and height are 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. What is the volume of this container? The volume is 1 meter cubed. This is the benefit, this is the possible benefit that you can derive from the container, right? You can fill it up with 1 meter cubed worth of water or furnace oil or whatever, right? This is the benefit that you get from that container. What is the cost related to? The cost would be related to the surface area of that container. So what would be the surface area in this case? The surface area would be 6 meters squared because you have 6 sides and each side has 1 meter squared of surface area. So you have 1 meter cubed of volume versus 6 meters squared of surface area. Now think of a bigger container, increasing the same container size to 2 by 2 by 2 meters, right? So you have each side now equal to 2 meters. What would be the volume of this container? The volume would be 2 multiplied by 2 multiplied by 2, that is 8 meters cubed. Whereas the surface area would be 2 times 2 is 4, that is the surface area of one side, multiplied by 6 and you get 24, right? So you have an 8 times increase in the volume of the container, but only a 4 times increase in the cost or the surface area of the container. So when you have a production process which involves anything which contains things in it, then increasing the size of that container or that input will usually increase your benefit many times more than it will increase your cost. Now, another reason why firms might leverage economies of scale could be related to how using larger machines has an impact on the efficiency of other types of resources being employed. So think of a small machine that needs to be monitored and operated by a single person. Now, if you increase the size of the machine, if you double the size of the machine, its impact on output will be almost double, right? but you might still need just one person to look after that machine, to maintain it, right? So you have used the other resources that you have available to you, that is labor, more efficiently. You had one machine and one laborer, and now you have two machines, but still one laborer. So as plants become more and more mechanized, as you increase the number and size of machines that you have, you can reduce your reliance on other factors. You can reduce your reliance on the number of people you need to look after or maintain those machines. There is also a point about byproducts. Now think of the process by which petroleum is produced, right? So you have oil refineries working day in and day out and producing oil and different types of oil by refining it. Now, oil has different types, but sometimes the firm or company is not intending to produce all of those different types. So there is gasoline, there is diesel, there is petroleum, there is coal tar, they're all different types. But these different types have uses in many other industries. So as you increase your size of production, if you have a lot of these byproducts which are being produced as part of the production process, you can realize a lot of cost savings by selling these byproducts in the market as well. So that if an oil refinery is interested only in producing gasoline, but it also produces diesel in the process, then it can sell a lot of that diesel in the market and get money for that. So as your scale of operation increases, your revenues from these byproducts also increase and lower your net costs. There are also different types of economies, financial economies, that firms can realize by becoming bigger. So think of a small firm which wants to borrow money from the bank. It goes to the bank, it says, "Sir, I need 100 million for this product, right? This particular project. I want to produce this particular product for export or for sales in the local market, and I want some working capital to set up my plant or to finance my inventory." The bank says, "Well, you are a very small firm. We don't know what your past record is. We don't know whether you will have enough cash with you at all times for you to be able to repay us," right? So they might set a higher interest rate for that firm, or might not give the loan to that firm at all, right? However, if you are a very big firm, giant firm, if you have very high or large scale of operation, then if you go to the bank, you have substantial bargaining power. The bank knows that you are a big customer. You have a lot of money coming in, you have large cash flows, you have the financial muscle to pay back the loan, and you are a good credit risk to that extent. So the bank might be willing to give you a very low interest rate on your loan. So might be willing to give you 5%, whereas to the earlier firm, smaller firm, it might not even give it at 15%. So there are financial savings that firms can make, big firms can make. Then if you are big enough, then you can buy quantities in bulk as well, right? So if you are a very big firm, then you can bulk order your inputs, especially raw materials and things like that, from other suppliers. For example, if you are a big supplier of steel, you can, and if you have different miners who are producing iron from ores, then you can bulk source your iron ore, which is used as a raw material in steel production, and get a very good price for that. This is called quantity discounts. That is, if you buy something in bulk, you get it at a cheaper price. Whereas a smaller firm would only be able to get the market price on that product. The seller of the raw material or the input would not be willing to give a quantity discount because the quantity is very small. Finally, there could be organizational economies of scale. When there is just one firm, then that one firm has a management, has accountants working for it, has a headquarter obviously, has a certain human resource departmental services that it offers. So there are some organizational aspects to the running of that firm. Now, no matter how big that firm becomes, these overheads remain pretty much constant. So you would still have one headquarter for a very large firm. So if two relatively small firms get together and form a very large firm, they would still have one headquarter, and therefore the costs of running that headquarter would probably not be equal to 2 times running the two headquarters. It would be perhaps 1.2 times or 1.3 times. So there are some costs of running a firm which do not increase commensurately as the size of the firm increases. You can also think about research and development costs that firms incur. If you are a small firm, sometimes research and development costs can amount to a lot, and you might not be able to finance those research and development costs. For example, if you want to set up a laboratory, you might not be able to finance the costs of setting up a laboratory, a research laboratory. But if 2 or 3 firms get together, they can share those costs, just like they can share administrative costs and financial costs, and there can be cost savings realized in that process. Now that concludes our discussion on the scale decision. That is, when a firm decides what scale of operations to choose for itself. And we saw that there could be advantages of being big in this case. A firm could realize economies of scale and cost savings by becoming bigger or having bigger machines or operating at a higher level of production. Let's now go to the second important decision that any firm has to make in trying to minimize its long-run costs. And this decision is related to the location of the firm. Whether the firm is located in Lahore or in Gujranwala or in Karachi. This is often a very important decision and determines the feasibility of the project or the process that the firm is involved in. Now, if you think of a firm as having linkages both in terms of its supply networks and the demand networks. So there are people who are supplying to the firm raw materials, labor, capital, etc. And then there are consumers for which the firm is producing, right? Sometimes producers are producing for other producers. So there are intermediary products. So for example, a steel producer might not be selling to consumers of cars. The steel producer might be selling to a producer of cars who needs that steel in order to produce the final product, which is cars, which is then consumed by the general public. But whatever, a firm needs to see where its main suppliers are based and where its main markets are based. It needs to get the raw materials and the inputs from its suppliers, and it needs to sell them onto the markets. Now, both the suppliers and the markets should be reasonably close to the firm. If the firm is lucky and both the suppliers and the markets are very close to each other, then it would make sense for the firm to set itself up very close to where the markets and the suppliers are, right? However, if the raw material supply is very far and the markets, the two are very far, then the firm will have to make a decision as to whether it wants to be closer to the raw materials or where the supply is coming from, or closer to the market. And the decision here would depend on the transportation cost of whether it costs more to transport or ship the raw materials to the firm, or whether it costs more for the firm to ship its final product to the market. So think of iron ore. A steel company which is refining steel or producing steel from iron might need to be very close to where the iron ore is located. So it gets the iron from the iron ore, and iron comes in bulk quantities. It is very difficult and very heavy to ship and transport. So it might be cheaper for the firm to be located very close to the iron ore. It gets the iron, then processes it there, produces the steel that it is involved in producing, and then ships or transports that steel all the way or further out to the market. So the transportation of steel might be cheaper because it can be done in small blocks, but the initial transportation of the iron might be very expensive. Consider the opposite case, where you have to, let's say, transport or ship bread, or let's say vegetables or fruit. These are all perishable items, items which have very small shelf lives. That is, they expire very quickly. A loaf of bread may expire in 2 or 3 days if it is left in the sun, or even less than that. Similarly, grapes or mangoes or oranges, if they are left out there and not consumed, they become overripe and they expire, right? They are not consumable anymore. So going back to the example of bread, it might be better for the firm to locate itself closer to the market. So it might consider spending more money on getting the inputs in the production of bread, that is flour and other wheat and oils or sugar or whatever, from distant suppliers. So the suppliers will ship those inputs to the firm, which is located very close to the market. But then the firm can produce the bread and immediately sell it on to the town or the nearest city, so that the bread does not perish or does not become unconsumable. So that is another factor which can affect the location decision of a firm. You can also have a situation in which a firm wants to service more than one market. So there are 5 or 6 markets. In that case, the firm might want to set itself up right in the middle of those 4 or 5 markets. So it can think of those 5 markets as some kind of a circle, and then it can set itself up right in the middle of that circle so that it can ship to all of those markets at a low cost, so that the transportation cost of the goods is minimized. Similarly, a firm could be using different raw materials and could be sourcing them from different suppliers which are in different cities. In that case, it would make sense for the firm to set itself up right in the middle of those different cities so that it can minimize the cost of transport from those different raw material suppliers to the firm. Now, the location of raw material suppliers or markets and the proximity or the desire to be closer to these markets and raw material suppliers is just one of the considerations in the decision to locate. There are other factors, like the availability of banking services near where the firm is set up. So the firm might want to set itself up in a city where banking services are easily available, where the communication networks are good, where electricity supply is stable, where labor is cheap. So all these factors come into consideration when a firm is deciding as to whether to locate in one city or another, or in an export zone, or in some industrial zone, etc., etc. Note that all these examples that we've been giving so far are related to factors which are internal to the firm, that is, related to the production process of the firm, and it's the firm's own requirements. There could also be scenarios in which something happens to the industry as a whole, and the individual firm is affected by that positively or negatively. And now we will be in the realm of external economies of scale. That is, we will talk about what happens to the overall industry and how that impacts on the costs of the individual firm. Now think of a growing industry. An industry, let's talk about the brokerage industry. So there are stock brokers or currency brokers who are dealing in different currencies and stocks and shares and bonds. And they get together and they try to maximize the benefit that they can by trading as fast and as much as they can between themselves, right? Now, if the industry grows, soon they might feel the need of developing a trading platform or a trading system whereby they can communicate very fast with each other and also very reliably. Now, if a new firm wants to enter the market, it will like to enter the market where such a platform or a communication system is already set up. So it would like to join that network of brokers rather than set its business up somewhere far away where there is no network, where there are no lines of communication, or they're not reliable. And therefore there are advantages to setting up when the industry size or where the industry size is quite large, right? So that's one. Another example is when the industry indulges in marketing activity or advertising activity, and the firm in its individual capacity benefits from that. So let's say Pepsi goes out and advertises its product, right? Now, when Pepsi is advertising its product, it does benefit Pepsi, of course, because people want to consume more Pepsi. But it can also increase the demand for black cold drinks further, or in itself. So the demand for all black drinks or all soda water might increase. So the demand for Coca-Cola might increase as well, which is a competitor of Pepsi's. So the individual firm in this case has benefited from the actions of the industry or some other competitor in the industry. Another example of external economies of scale could be the setting up of a credit information bureau between banks. So when a number of banks are operating in a city or in a market, then they might decide to set up a credit sharing system in which credit information sharing system in which they can capture the credit information about any client who has dealt with any other bank. And this benefits all the banks participating in this scheme. But it makes sense and it is cost efficient only when the number of banks operating in that area is sufficiently large enough. So this is another case in which the size of the industry as a whole determines the external economies accruing to each of the individual players in the industry. Now, these are all examples of external economies of scale. That is, cases in which the higher or the bigger size of the industry benefits the individual firm. But it is also possible for the opposite to happen. It is possible for external diseconomies of scale to take place as well. How will this happen? I'll just give you one small example, but this will illustrate the concept quite clearly. And the example is, let's say the firms are involved in refining oil. And oil is scarce. Oil is scarce in the world, and oil might be scarce in a particular country or in a particular area. Now, if all the firms use the same scarce resource to produce or refine oil, then as the resource becomes smaller and smaller, that is, as the number of firms using that oil becomes bigger and bigger, then the price of oil will go up, and therefore the costs of any individual firm will increase. You can also think of the example of a fishing pond. So if there is one person who is fishing in that pond, then the number of fish might be just right for him to fish. But if 10 people come and fish in the same pond, the fish will start disappearing very soon. And this will negatively impact all of the fishermen or all of the people who are involved in fishing. So, my friends, we've discussed three important decisions for the firm. We've discussed the decision about scale, that is the size of operations. We've discussed the decision about location, as to where the firm must locate. And we've also discussed the impact of the external developments happening in the industry on any single firm. What we're now going to discuss is the fourth and probably the most important decision before the firm. And that is the decision on how to get to the optimum combination of inputs. Remember the production function. It basically said Q is equal to F, and then you had the factors of production in there. K, L, natural resources, entrepreneurship. Let's take the example of labor and capital. Let's say there are only just these two factors. How should the firm decide how much labor to use in the production process and how much capital to use? What is the guiding principle for this very important decision for the firm? Now, obviously, labor costs something and capital costs something, right? And by substituting one for the other, the firm might be able to realize some cost savings. This is obvious. But we need to unravel a principle that the firm can employ in order to get to this optimum use or optimum utilization of factors. What is the optimal combination of inputs that the firm must use? Now, if you remember our discussion in the utility analysis part of consumption, we introduced the equimarginal principle, which basically said that the marginal utility derived from all of the goods or should be equal, that the marginal utility derived from the last dollar spent on all of the goods should be equal. That was the equimarginal principle, which basically translated into MUX over PX should be equal to MUY over PY should be equal to MUA over PA, and so on, where A, B, and X and Y were goods. Here we have the same setup, but only that marginal utility is replaced by marginal physical product, and the price of goods is replaced by the price of factors. A firm will choose that combination of inputs at which the marginal physical product of the last dollar spent on all the inputs is equal. So if the firm has just two inputs, then the optimal combination will obtain when MPPK over price of K is equal to MPPL over price of L, which is simply the wage rate, the price of L, that is. Let's illustrate this a little bit better by using a slide. Here we see that if MPPL over PL is not equal to MPPK over PK, it would be possible to reduce cost per unit of output by using a different combination of labor and capital. For example, if MPPL over PL is greater than MPPK over PK, more labor should be used relative to capital, since the firm is getting a greater physical return for its money from using extra workers than it is getting from using extra capital. However, as more and more labor is used per unit of capital, diminishing returns to labor set in. This comes in from the law of diminishing marginal returns. Thus, MPPL will begin to fall. Likewise, as less capital is used per unit of labor, the MPPK will rise. This will continue until MPPL over PL is again equal to MPPK over PK. At this point, the firm will stop substituting labor for capital. Since no further gain can be made by substituting one factor for another, this combination of factors or choice of technique can be said to be the most efficient. In the language of economics, this is called the state of technical or productive efficiency. We can also see how the optimum combination of factors would arise when you have many factors and not just two. Here, the equimarginal principle can simply be applied to more than two factors. That is, MPPA over PA is equal to MPPB over PB is equal to MPPC over PC, and so on until MPPN over PN. Now, in this example or in this illustration, we have assumed that the prices of the factors are fixed. That is, PL, PK are fixed. But in reality, this might not be the case, and this can create complications. We will discuss it further in our next lecture. In our next lecture, we will also discuss the other approach to getting to the optimum combination of inputs. And that approach is the iso-quant, iso-cost approach. This is analogous to the indifference curve approach that we used in the analysis of consumption. So, my friends, with that, we come to the end of today's lecture. I hope you've assimilated the concepts of the long-run theory of production, the returns to scale concepts that were introduced, the location and scale decisions that a firm makes, how it makes those decisions. All these things are fundamental to a better understanding of how firms operate in a real economy and make important decisions about where to locate, how much to produce, and what combination of factors to use. Go home and become more comfortable with those terms like increasing returns to scale and decreasing returns to scale. Understand the difference with diminishing marginal returns to factors, because that difference is really critical. We'll come back in our next lecture and develop what we have studied today further. Till then, it is Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.